secret apartment, or a betrayal that would end their marriage. Instead, billionaire Julian Vane watched from the shadows as his wife knelt in the dirt, doing the one thing he thought she was incapable of. The silence in the Vane penthouse didn't just hang in the air, it suffocated. Julian Vane sat at the head of a mahogany table that could seat 30, though tonight, it only seated 2. Across from him, Elena moved her fork with the precision of a clockmaker, pushing a piece of sea bass across her plate without ever taking a bite. She was beautiful, a marble statue in a silk gown, but to Julian she felt like a stranger he had been living with for 7 years. "You're leaving early tomorrow?" Julian asked, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the shimmering lights of Manhattan. Elena didn't look up. "Yes, I have errands. The charity committee." Julian felt a familiar spark of heat in his chest. Errands? It was always errands. For the last 6 months, every Tuesday and Thursday, Elena disappeared from 9 a.m. until sunset. When she returned, she smelled not of expensive perfume, but of something sharp and medicinal. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, yet she refused to say where she had been. He was a man who built an empire on information. He knew the stock price of his competitors before they did. He knew the secrets of senators. But he didn't know where his own wife went when she left their home. The suspicion had started as a small seed, planted by a casual comment from his head of security. "Mrs. Vane declined the driver again today, sir. Said she wanted to walk. But the GPS on her phone, it goes dark near the East River docks." That seed had grown into a towering forest of paranoia. Was it another man? A secret life? Or was she simply tired of the cold, calculated world he had built for her? If you've ever felt like someone you love is hiding a part of themselves from you, let us know in the comments how you handled that realization. That night, after Elena had fallen into a restless sleep in the primary suite, Julian sat in his study. He held a small, rusted brass key he had found tucked into the lining of her favorite Chanel handbag. It didn't belong to any lock in their home. It looked like it belonged to a locker or a gate, something old, something cheap. "You want to play games, Elena?" Julian whispered to the empty room. "Fine. Let's see who plays better." He didn't call a private investigator. He didn't trust them not to leak the story to the press. Instead, Julian Vane, the man worth $11 billion, decided to become a ghost. The next morning, Julian didn't head to the Vane Tower. He went to a small apartment he owned under a shell company in Queens. There he shed the $3,000 suit. He put on a pair of faded work pants, a heavy canvas jacket with grease stains, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He applied a light prosthetic to his nose and a bit of theatrical stubble to his jaw. Looking in the cracked mirror of the dingy bathroom, he didn't see a titan of industry. He saw a man who looked like he had spent 20 years fixing boilers. He saw Elias. He arrived at the East River docks an hour before Elena. He waited in a rusted-out van he'd bought for cash, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't since his first $1 million deal. At 9:15 a.m., a yellow taxi pulled up. Elena stepped out. She was dressed down in a simple trench coat, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked around nervously before ducking into an alleyway between 2 crumbling warehouses. Julian stepped out of the van, his boots splashing in a puddle of oily water. The hunt had begun. But as he followed her into the labyrinth of the industrial district, he had no idea that the man he was, the cold, ruthless Julian Vane, was about to be destroyed by what he was about to see. The air in the industrial district was thick with the smell of salt and rotting timber. Julian, now Elias, kept a careful distance, his heart performing a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched as Elena stopped in front of a heavy, rusted iron door that looked like it belonged to an abandoned meatpacking plant. She pulled out a key, the twin to the one he'd found, and disappeared inside. Julian waited exactly 3 minutes. Every instinct he possessed, the same instincts that allowed him to crush competitors in the boardroom, told him he was about to walk into a scene of betrayal. He pictured a lover, perhaps a younger man, someone who offered the warmth Julian's cold brilliance never could. The thought made his jaw ache with suppressed rage. He approached the door. It wasn't fully latched. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning a low, mournful protest. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through windows caked in decades of soot. But it wasn't a secret apartment. It was a locker room, smelling of industrial soap and damp concrete. Julian ducked behind a row of dented metal lockers as he heard footsteps. He peered through the gap between the lockers. Elena was there. She had stripped off her trench coat, revealing a simple gray t-shirt. She began to scrub her hands and forearms at a communal sink with a ferocity that stunned him. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and pink. Then she reached into a locker and pulled out a faded blue nurse's scrub top and a pair of sensible rubber shoes. She wasn't meeting a man. She was changing her identity. Julian followed her deeper into the building, navigating a maze of plastic sheeting and temporary plywood walls. As he turned a corner, the environment shifted. The grime of the warehouse gave way to a makeshift infirmary. It was clean, frighteningly clean, despite the peeling paint on the ceiling. There were rows of cots, maybe 20 in total. And they were all occupied. Julian watched, paralyzed, as his wife, the woman who complained if her champagne wasn't exactly 45 degrees, approached an elderly man hacking with a wet, rattling cough. She didn't flinch. She sat on the edge of his cot, took a basin of warm water and began to wash the man's feet. "How are we today, Samuel?" she asked, her voice carrying a tenderness Julian hadn't heard in a decade. "Better for seeing you, Angel," the man rasped. Julian leaned against a cold brick pillar, his mind reeling. This was the Forbidden Zone, a section of the city his own company, Vane Development, had recently purchased. He had signed the eviction notices himself last month to make way for the Vane Plaza, a luxury condo complex. He had been told the area was mostly vacant. He realized then that it wasn't. These were the people who had fallen through the cracks, the undocumented, the homeless, the elderly with no kin. And his wife was hiding them from him. For the next 4 days, Julian lived a double life. By morning, he was the Titan of Wall Street, barking orders and finalizing the demolition permits for the very district he visited by afternoon. By midday, he was Elias, the quiet maintenance man who had found work at a nearby garage, allowing him to linger around the warehouse. He began to volunteer. To get closer to Elena without being recognized, he offered to fix the warehouse's failing plumbing and the temperamental heater that left the patients shivering at night. He worked in the shadows, his hands becoming calloused and stained with actual dirt. He watched Elena constantly. He saw her face the challenges he usually solved with a wire transfer, shortages of antibiotics, leaking roofs, and the constant fear of the city inspectors. One Tuesday, a man arrived at the warehouse. He was tall, athletic, and carried a large medical crate. Julian's blood turned to ice. He watched Elena run to the man and embrace him. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their heads close together. "This is it," Julian thought, his hand tightening around a pipe wrench. "The doctor. The partner. The real reason she's here." He crept closer, hiding behind a stack of oxygen tanks. "We're almost out of the morphine, Elena," the man said. "And the city is moving up the demolition of this block. We have 3 days before the bulldozers arrive." "I know, Marcus," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm trying to find a new space, but Julian, my husband, he's bought everything. He's turning the whole district into glass and steel. He doesn't see the people living in the shadows of his towers." "You have to tell him," Marcus said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I can't," she sobbed, and the sound broke Julian's heart into 1,000 pieces. "If I tell him, he'll just see a liability. He'll see a legal headache. He doesn't know how to love something that doesn't turn a profit. I've lost him, Marcus. I lost him to his own empire years ago." Julian stood frozen. The other man was Marcus, a volunteer resident from the local hospital. There was no affair. There was only a woman trying to save lives from the collateral damage caused by her husband's greed. He looked at his hands, the hands of Elias. They were dirty, but for the first time in years they felt useful. He looked at the patients, the woman in bed 4 who Elena had stayed with until 2 a.m. because she was afraid of the dark, the boy with the broken leg who Elena had bought books for out of her own grocery money. He wasn't spying on a cheating wife. He was spying on a saint. And he was the villain of her story. The tension peaked on Friday morning. Julian was at his corporate desk when his VP of operations walked in. "Good news, Mr. Vane. The police and the demolition crew are clearing out the East River sector this afternoon. We'll be ahead of schedule." Julian looked at the permit on his desk. The address was 442 Industrial Way. The warehouse. "Cancel it," Julian said, his voice a low growl. "Sir? I said cancel the demolition. Now. But the contracts, the fines will be millions." Julian stood up, the power of his true identity returning, but tempered by something new. "I don't care about the fines. Get my car. And call the head of our medical charity division. I need a mobile surgical unit and 5 transport vans at the East River docks in 20 minutes. "Who are we moving, sir?" Julian looked out at the city, his eyes stinging. "My soul," he whispered. "We're moving my soul." The roar of diesel engines signaled the end. Outside the rusted iron doors of the warehouse, The flashing yellow lights of construction vehicles cut through the afternoon fog. Julian, still in his grease-stained Elias coveralls, stood inside the infirmary watching the panic rise. "They're here," a young volunteer screamed. "The police and the bulldozers are at the gate." Elena stood in the center of the room, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a desperate, fierce courage. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She stepped toward the entrance, putting her body between the heavy machinery and the 20 fragile lives resting on the cots behind her. "Marcus, get the patients to the back exit," she commanded. "I'll talk to them. I'll tell them we have medical emergencies. They can't legally move us if people are in critical condition." "Elena, it's a Vane project," Marcus said, his voice grim as he gathered medical files. "They don't care about conditions. They care about the schedule." Julian watched from the shadows of the boiler room, his heart hammering. He saw the foreman, a man he had hired personally for his no-nonsense reputation, march through the front doors, flanked by 2 private security guards. "All right, clear out," the foreman shouted, his voice echoing off the high rafters. "This building is slated for immediate demolition. You're trespassing on Vane Global property." Elena stepped forward, her chin tilted high. "There are people here who cannot be moved. This man in bed 6 has a failing heart. That woman just had a seizure. If you bring those walls down, you're committing murder." The foreman laughed, a cold, metallic sound. "I've got orders signed by Julian Vane himself. He doesn't like delays and he definitely doesn't like squatters. Move or we move you." He reached out to grab Elena's arm to escort her out. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He stepped out of the shadows, dropping the heavy pipe wrench he was holding. The clang of metal on concrete silenced the room. "Take your hands off her," Julian said. The foreman turned, squinting at the man in the dirty baseball cap. "Who the hell are you? One of the mechanics? Get lost before I have you arrested too." Julian walked into the light. He reached up and slowly pulled off the baseball cap. He peeled away the prosthetic from his nose and wiped the grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. The transformation was subtle, but as he stood tall, the Elias slouch vanished, replaced by the terrifying, cold authority of the man who owned the skyline. The foreman's face went from irritation to absolute terror. "And Mr. Vane? Sir? Why are you dressed like a—" "I said," Julian repeated, his voice a low, vibrating hum of power, "take your hands off my wife." The room went deathly silent. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the man she had lived with for 7 years, seeing the dirt under his fingernails and the fierce, protective rage in his eyes. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. You were here? All this time?" Julian didn't look at her yet, he couldn't. The shame was too great. Instead, he turned his gaze to the foreman. "Call off the crews," Julian ordered. "Tell the city that 442 Industrial Way is no longer a demolition site. It is now the headquarters of the Vane Medical Foundation. If a single brick is touched, you'll never work in this hemisphere again." "But sir, the condos, the billion-dollar contract." "I'll eat the cost," Julian snapped. "Now get out. Before I decide to demo your career instead of this building." The foreman and his guards scrambled out of the building, the sound of retreating engines following closely behind. Julian stood in the center of the makeshift ward, surrounded by the invisible people he had spent his life ignoring. He slowly turned to face Elena. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, looking at him as if he were a ghost. "You spied on me," she breathed, the realization hitting her. "You thought I was— What did you think I was doing, Julian?" "I thought I was losing you," Julian said, his voice breaking. He looked around at the cots, at the dying man whose feet Elena had washed, and then back at her. "I thought you were hiding a secret that would destroy me. I didn't realize you were hiding a secret that could save me." He took a step toward her, his expensive soul finally catching up to his billion-dollar body. "I've spent my life building walls, Elena. I never realized you were spent yours trying to keep people from being crushed by them. In this moment of truth, everything changed. Have you ever had a moment where the person you thought you knew turned out to be someone entirely different? And better? Tell us your story in the comments." The following weeks were not a quiet return to luxury, but a loud, frantic reconstruction of 2 lives. The Vane penthouse, once a sterile museum of success, began to feel like a home. There were mud-stained boots in the foyer and stacks of medical blueprints on the Italian marble kitchen island. Julian didn't return to his $3,000 suits immediately. He found he preferred the simplicity of a cotton shirt and rolled-up sleeves. He didn't just fund the hospice, he became its architect. He leveraged his entire logistics network to transform the old warehouse into a state-of-the-art facility, now officially named the Elena Vane Center for Community Health. But the real resolution happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after the confrontation. Julian was sitting in the back of the ward, helping an elderly woman learn to use a tablet so she could video call her grandson. He looked up to see Elena standing in the doorway watching him. She wasn't wearing her Chanel or her silk, she was in her scrubs, her hair messy, a smudge of ink on her cheek. She looked more beautiful to him than she ever had under the chandeliers of a gala. "You missed the board meeting," she said softly, walking over to him. "I told them the board could wait," Julian replied, standing up. "Mr. Henderson's physical therapy was more important. Besides, they know where to find me now." Elena reached out, taking his hand. For years, their touch had been polite, a performance for the public. Now it was grounded, heavy with shared secrets and a new, unbreakable trust. "I used to be so afraid of you finding out," Elena whispered. "I thought you'd see this as a weakness. I thought you'd see me as a weakness." Julian shook his head, pulling her closer. "I was the one who was weak, Elena. I was hiding behind a pile of money because I was terrified that if I stopped building, I'd have to look at who I really was. You didn't just save these people. You saved me from becoming a monument to my own ego." He led her out to the small garden they had planted in the courtyard, where the invisible residents were now sitting in the sun. The shadow of the massive Vane Plaza, which was now being redesigned to include affordable housing units, stretched across the grass. "I spent my life trying to own the city," Julian said, looking at the skyline. "I never realized that the only part of it worth having was the part that needed me back." They stood there together, two people who had started as strangers in a marriage of convenience and ended as partners in a mission of mercy. The billionaire who went undercover to find a betrayal had found a miracle instead. He had gone looking for a reason to leave, and instead he found every reason to stay. As the sun set, painting the glass towers of Manhattan in shades of gold and violet, Julian realized that his net worth had never been higher, not because of his stock portfolio, but because of the woman standing by his side and the lives they were rebuilding, one brick at a time. True wealth isn't what you gather, but what you give away. If this story moved you or reminded you of the power of a second chance, please leave a comment below with the word redemption. We love hearing your thoughts on these journeys of the heart. Thank you for following this emotional journey.